Fred was walking along a steep cliff one day. When he got too close, off. On the way down, he grabbed a branch, and that was able to stop his fall. Only he realized, as he was holding onto the branch and looking down, that he was well over 1,000 feet in the air. There was no way to climb up. "Help! Help!" he cried. "Is anyone up there?" He screamed for hours. No one could hear him. He was about to give up when he finally heard a voice. "Fred! Fred! Are you there? Can you hear me, Fred?" "Yes? Yes, I can hear you. Where are you?" "I'm down here." "I can see you, Fred. Are you all right?" "Yes, I think so. But where are you? I can't see you." "I'm the Lord, Fred. I'm everywhere." "The Lord? Do you mean God?" "Yes, Fred, that's me." "God, please help me. I promise. If you'll get me down from this branch, I'll never sin again. I'll be in church every week. I'll serve you all my life. Please, God." "Easy now, Fred. Those promises here. Let's start by getting you out of here. Here's what I want you to do. Listen carefully, Fred." "God, I'll do anything. Please, just help me." "Okay, let go of that branch." "What?" "I said, let go of that branch. Just let go, Fred. Trust me." There was a long pause. Finally, Fred yelled up, "Help! Help! Is there anyone else up there?" It's a funny story, right? I love stories like that. I love stories like Zacchaeus. And yet still, if you really think about it, as funny and as humorous as that story is, I think we can all find at least one point in our life when we can relate to Fred here. I'm talking about times when, in our life, when everything is on the line. Times in our life when everything is at stake, where everything could be gone in a moment. And in our darkness, in those dark times, in our grief, we cry out to the Lord. And all we hear in His response is, "Do you trust me? Do you believe me that I can come through and that I can take care of you? Will you depend on me to provide for you?" And God tells us, let go of that branch. It's the question that God asks you, and He asks me. It's the question that God asks Abraham in our text this morning, in Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. "Now it came to pass after these things that God did test Abraham." And what's about to take place in this story is a test. Only, unlike what many people tell us about this story, I personally don't think this story is a test of Abraham's loyalty, not a test of his devotion. I personally don't believe this is a test of Abraham's love for God. I know if you've studied this story up to now, we've seen Abraham building altars for God all over Canaan. God and Abraham have had dinner together there in Genesis 18. Abraham was God's friend, and he loved him. The question in Genesis 22 is not, how much do you love me, Abraham? He's not testing his devotion, his commitment to the Lord. He's not wondering what Abraham will sacrifice for the Lord. It's not a test of love. Genesis 22 is probably the greatest test of faith that I find in the Bible. It's a test that God had brought to Abraham at the end of his life. And the question that this text is asking Abraham, and really asking all of us, does Abraham trust? And you hear God asking this man of faith, you trust me to provide for you? Do you believe me that I will come through? And you hear him asking Abraham to let go of the branch. But you notice in verse 1 as we read it, when does this test come? After these things. After answering God's call to a life of blessing in his home in Ur, after traveling hundreds of miles with his family, Ur of the Chaldeans down to the land of Canaan, and building an altar and calling upon the name of the Lord, there in Genesis 12. After wandering down to Egypt when a famine struck Canaan, and taking matters into his own hands, finding himself in dark places like that, where he doubts God's goodness and he doubts God's power, only to emerge later from that darkness closer and stronger in his faith. After coming down the winding road of his life of faith, a road marked by success and failure, both by gains and losses, where sometimes he chose to walk down that less traveled road of faith in obedience and trusting God to provide for him, and other times walking down the road of unbelief and fear, where he tries to help God out by helping him get that promised child there in Genesis 16. After all of this in his life, finally, last week, Abraham received the child of. In his old age, God had given Sarah a son, the son that he'd been waiting for. Genesis 21, verses 1 and 2, we saw God bringing about the promised seed, where these verses read, and the Lord visited Sarah as he had promised. Genesis 22:1, and for Sarah as he had spoken. Verse 2, for Sarah conceived and bore a son in his old age, at the set time which God had spoken unto him. The storyteller reminds us no less than 3 times there in those 2 verses that God had done what he'd promised, and that God had done what he had spoken. Their long-awaited son, which they had waited for over 25 years, had finally been born, and their future was secure. God's blessing had finally come to Abraham and to Sarah. And God says to Abraham there in these verses, I have done what I promised. I have provided for you and Sarah. I have given you a son. You trusted me, Abraham, and I came through, didn't I? And Abraham and Sarah begin to enjoy that reward that comes when we trust God by faith. And they get to watch Isaac grow up. It's a wonderful ending to a wonderful story. Only it's not the end of the story, is it? Because after all of that, as Isaac grows up, maybe 10, 12, 15 years later, after these things, we hear Moses telling us in Genesis 22:1 that God did test Abraham. It's an important comment, isn't it? Because, and we as readers here, we're privy to that comment. That knowledge about what is coming in the story now is laid to bear. We understand what's about to take place. It's a test. It helps us understand God and what he's about to ask Abraham to do. But understand something. Abraham never read Genesis 22. This chapter wasn't in his Bible. He didn't have this narrative comment laying beside verse 1 that we get to enjoy here. All he knows is what God tells him next. And he said to him, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here am I. Verse 2, then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on the mountains of which I shall tell you. That command here to go, it's an interesting command, isn't it? You know, there's only one other place in the book of Genesis where this command appears just like this. Only one other place in this book where we read the words stated exactly as they are here in Genesis 22. You know where that is? We find it in Genesis 12. And we're supposed to think back to that passage in Genesis 12:1. We're supposed to remember the beginning of the story of Abraham's life of faith. At that time, God commanded him to go and to leave the land of his fathers. Go forth from your country, Abraham, from your people and your father's house, and go unto a land, unto a place that I will show you. And here we find that second command. This is 22, at the end of Abraham's life. Only here, God's not asking Abraham to leave his past behind anymore. He's not asking him to leave behind his family, his father's house. Here in Genesis 22, God is asking Abraham to surrender his future and to give up the greatest treasure of his entire life, his son, his only son, and the one he loves. He says, go unto a mountain, one of the mountains, unto a place, unto a land that I will show you. Picture Abraham talking to the Lord here, you know. Abraham, I want you to take your son. Which one, God? I have two sons. Take your only son. Lord, Abraham argues, well, I have Ishmael's my only son of Hagar, and Isaac is the only son of Sarah. Love, answered the Lord. I love them both, God. Isaac was God's reply. Isaac, the child that God promised him. This child of Abraham and Sarah was the one they had waited a lifetime to receive. Isaac, he embodied everything that Abraham had lived for up to this point. Everything he believed about God, all of his dreams for God and the fulfillment of that promise, everything rested on that boy. Isaac, he was Abraham's greatest treasure, the son of his old age, and he loved him. You know, I know God knows what he's asking him to do. You can almost hear the sympathy behind the words, take your son, your only son, the one you love, and sacrifice him as an offering unto me. And what would Abraham do? Would he trust God with his greatest treasure? Does he believe God could still bless him? Still make of him a great nation, the father of many nations? That's what God promised. Even if he surrenders his only son. He trusted God with his past back in Genesis 12, but now would he trust him with his future too? Or would he hold back this time? Look for some other way like he did with Hagar? Would he take matters into his own hands, or would he trust God to provide a way? Well, let's keep on reading, and we'll see what he does. Verse 3. So Abraham rose up early in the morning. It's interesting here, as we read these verses, Abraham performs all the chores himself. He has servants that could help him, and yet he doesn't. He saddled his donkey, took two of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and he rose, and he went to the place which God had told him. What's the name of this place? Where is it? Pay attention to that. It's an unnamed place, appears many times throughout the story. We don't find out the name of this place until the end. At this point, the name doesn't really matter, but at the end of the chapter, I think it'll make sense. The passage continues that as they walk and journey toward the place, I'm sure it's a quiet journey. Abraham, Isaac, the servants, and the donkeys. I bet Abraham probably didn't look at Isaac too much. Looks away, blinking back the tears. There's a lot of debate as to how old Isaac was at this point, right? And we really don't know. The narrative doesn't say. But no matter how old you think he might have been, Isaac clearly was not just some little boy anymore. He was old enough to help his dad. He carried a lot of the materials. He sensed something was happening, I'm sure. Verse 4, on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." Nowhere in this story did God promise to spare Isaac. Never. And yet Abraham is convinced they're going to come back. Was it wishful thinking? Does he really believe he's saying that both of them, the father and son, would return together? I think he did. I think Abraham had come to a place in his life where he understood something about God and remembered how God had given him Isaac. And if God could do that, if he could give him Isaac from a dead womb, then surely he could give him back from a charred altar. I think he believed that somehow God would work things out, and somehow, in some way, God would take care of his son. He straps the wood on Isaac's back, and yet again, he carries the torch and the knife himself. So Abraham, verse 6, took the wood of the burnt offering, and he laid it on Isaac his son, took the fire in his hand and the knife, and the two of them went together. Mount Moriah. It's incredible how many times things happen in the Bible on mountaintops, isn't it? As I was reading, someone pointed that out. Noah's Ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat after the flood. Moses received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. In fact, if you remember later in the book of Kings, it's going to be on Mount Carmel where Elijah will defeat the prophets of Baal. The temple is built on Mount Zion. Jesus preaches his most famous sermon on a mountain, and he's later crucified on a hill called Calvary, and would later ascend into heaven off of the Mount of Olives. Important instances throughout God's Word where mountaintop experiences take place. And this is another one of those instances. Because Abraham's journey of faith through all leading to this moment, to this place that God will show him. Can you imagine how he must have felt? Imagine what was going through his mind as him and his son make that steep incline up Mount Moriah. Isaac, my son, my only son, the one I love. There's nothing but silence at first, until finally someone speaks. Only it's not Abraham that breaks the silence. It's not God. It's Isaac. And his question, all it really does is the grief that we sense as we read the story. It makes it kind of worse. Yes, son. What's going on? You have the torch, the knife. I have the wood. Where's the animal? Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, "My father," and he said, "Here am I, my son. Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And as you read Abraham's response here. You begin at this point in the story to understand what's going on in his heart. All of these years, all of working and growing in his faith, trying to work things out on his own, trying to fix things, and watching God repair all the disasters that he made in his life. Abraham has grown to a point where here we see him trusting the Lord to take care of him. He will come through for him. Maybe not in the way he expects. Verse 8, and Abraham said, my son, God will provide. God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. I don't know how, but somehow, in some way, God is going to come through. And we're going to walk back down that mountain together. I don't know how, but I know God is going to take care of us, Isaac. That phrase, will provide, literally, it means God will see to it. Now, that doesn't mean that Abraham believed that God necessarily. I suppose he might have thought that God could change his mind at the last minute. Sure. But when you look at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, we kind of get a glimpse, a little inspired glimpse into what was going on in Abraham's mind. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered, 11 says, verse 19, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. Abraham concluded. He reasoned in his own heart. He reckoned, based on all that he'd been through, based on all that God had in his life, he had come to a place where he was willing to trust God with his greatest treasure, his son, his only son, the one he loved. Even if God made him go through with it, even if God had him sacrifice Isaac, he was convinced that God could bring his son back to life again. Friend, that is faith. Verse 8 continues again. So the two of them went together. That's the second time that phrase came up in these past two verses. And each time the dagger goes a little deeper. Each time we hear it, we're supposed to feel and feel the way that they feel, to picture what they're picturing as they walk, the two of them, up Mount Moriah, father and son, together. A father walking beside his son, the one he loved. They finally reached the top in verse 9. They came to the place in which God had told them. And here again, you see Abraham doing the work himself. But what's strange about this part of the story is he still isn't offering any resistance. Isn't that incredible? He had to have known what was going on at this point. And even though Isaac was enough to haul the firewood up the mountain, the narrative doesn't describe any kind of fight. Abraham built an altar there, it says, and placed the wood in order, and bound his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife. I don't know if you catch how quickly the verbs are moving throughout this story. He placed, he bound, laid, stretched, and he took the knife from his sheath, slit Isaac's throat. His son, the one he loved. Must have been a difficult moment for both of them. Isaac lying on the wood looking up at his dad. Abraham holding the knife to his son's throat, tied up, laid on the altar, looking into the eyes of the child of promise. You imagine what Isaac must have seen in the eyes of his dad, staring back at him, watching his father hold a dagger in his hand. It doesn't say, but I know Abraham probably hesitated once or twice. As he waits, as if to give God just one last chance to deliver him, one last chance to stop this moment. God, he's my son. He's our only son. I love him. But God is testing Abraham. And Abraham, in a sense, testing God too. I mean, what happened next? And just as the muscles tense up and the knife approaches the boy's neck, at that very last moment, our man of faith hears that awesome voice calling to him from heaven. The voice of God. One last time. At least the last. I'm sure it was probably the most ever heard. And all he heard was his name. Avraham. The name that God gave him. Avraham. The father of many nations. And he heard it twice. Abraham. You know, when a name is like that is repeated in Scripture, it usually indicates deep affection. God cried out to Moses in the burning bush, Moses, Moses. When Absalom died, his father David cried out for his son Absalom. Absalom. When Jesus was standing there before Martha, he cried, Martha, Martha. It's a cry of affection. The old man, he freezes. And I quickly responded, Abraham, here I am, Lord. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear me, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now I know that you fear God. Only it's not a fear like the fear Abraham had felt. Not the fear when he lied about Sarah. Not the fear he had for Pharaoh. Wasn't the fear he experienced in the dark nights of his life when he doubted he could keep his promises. No, not that kind of fear. Abraham feared God. It was a reverence. It was an awe. Verse 13, then Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked. And there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its thorns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place. The name of the place gets a name. Yahweh Jireh. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. As it is said this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. In response to Abraham's willingness, in response to his obedience, the Lord promises, moreover, to bless him with more sons and daughters, more than possibly descendants, and then through them to bless the entire world. And here Abraham has finally become the man that God has called him to be. Verse 15, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven. And by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing will I bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand of the sea is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gates of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. And just as Abraham had promised his servants, at the end of the story, he and Isaac, they worshiped on the mountain, went down together. Verse 19, so Abraham returned to his young men. You imagine the tears that were going through their eyes when they met who were waiting. See, I told you we'd be back. Went to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt in Beersheba. It's a powerful story of testing. But I dare say that God leads most of us up Mount Moriah a time and a two in our life. And up there on the top of those mountains, he's to trust him with the dearest and the best of our lives. And yet, that is exactly where the story intersects, isn't it? It's not a question of who you love more, your child God or your spouse. I'm supposed to love my kids. I'm commanded to love my wife, even as myself. It's not a question of who do I love. It's a question of how much do I trust God with my greatest treasures. At a time in my life when I'm struggling, He will test me, and He will test you. And He'll ask us to do something, to go somewhere, and to serve someone in a way that feels pretty risky, doesn't it? And the question is, are you prepared to trust Him with your best, with your deepest needs, with your highest hopes? For Abraham, all of that was embodied. He was that ever received from the Lord. And so God asked him to lay him on an altar, put Isaac on the altar. But God may ask me to do something else. He might say to you, take your career, that job of your dreams, the one that you've been working towards all your life, your lifelong ambition, lay that on the altar for me. Maybe it's your stuff. God will say, take your possessions, your hard-earned possessions, possessions that give you security and significance, that make you look important to everyone around you. Place those in my hands. Take your retirement years, those years you've been looking forward to all your life, and make those years available to me. Take your broken heart and your broken dreams and lay them at my feet. And He might even say, take your children, take your grandchildren, or your great-grandchildren, and offer them up to me. For you and I, the sacrifice that He asks of us may look different. Take your dreams, your fears, your treasures, lay them on my altar. But even though they look different, even when they're unique to us, the question is always the same, isn't it? Do you trust me? Do you believe that I will come through? Will you depend on me to provide for you? Let go. That day, Abraham let go. He trusted God, and you know what? God came through. Well, Abraham's journey isn't over just yet. We have a few chapters left. Writer said this with regard to this passage. Even though Abraham has more to learn, he says, the journey of faith, it's not just about where you're going. It's about who you become along the way. And Abraham had become the man that God wanted him to be after years of fear, years of faith. Are you prepared to let go of your greatest treasure? Whatever that might be. Will you trust God to provide for you in the dark? As Romans 8:32 says, and we close, He who delivered Him up for us all, how shall He not offer of your birth?